Trigger warning. This episode contains graphic details about minors. So if you want to avoid certain parts, please check the show notes. Hey everyone, I am Rashad K, and this is They Forgot About Us, a true crime podcast that tells the stories of murdered and missing African American women, men, and children. On this episode of They Forgot About Us, I tell the story of the Arkansas Negro Boys Industrial School fire of 1959. On March 5th, 1959, 21 black boys burned to death. In this episode, I speak about the history of the school and the cover-up of the fire. The Arkansas Negro Boys Industrial School was a segregated juvenile correctional facility and work farm for black youth. Established in 1923, the school initially operated in Jefferson County, just outside of Pine Bluff. In the 1930s, it relocated to Wrightsville, a small town about 13 miles southeast of Little Rock, Arkansas. In 1921, the Arkansas legislature established the Institution for Black Juvenile Delinquents. 2 years later, the board hired Tandy Washington Coggs as a foreman to supervise construction. Impressed by his abilities, they promoted him to superintendent. And in January 1924, judges attempted to commit boys to the school, but the first admissions were denied due to insufficient operating funds. To address this, Tandy began networking to secure funding from various black organizations. As a result, on July 1st, 1924, the Negro Boys Industrial School officially opened. At its inception, there were 75 black boys under the age of 16 confined in the state prison. This number did not include children in county or municipal jails or county prison work farms. By 1926, 217 boys had been committed. 84 were paroled or discharged, and only 6 escaped. Only 6 of the 84 returned to the correctional facility. While he served as superintendent, the boys were fed a good diet, and the institution was clean and well kept. They also had a merit system, so the boys could work their way out of the system if they chose to. In the school's earlier years, the school had a tennis court, and they played basketball and went swimming. Tandy Washington was more than capable of educating the boys in skills other than agricultural labor. So outside of agriculture, the boys learned poultry raising, carpentry, shoe repairing, laundry work, and household tasks. In the 1920s, Tandy Calvin comes to live on the land of the NBIS with his son, Tandy Washington. This is possibly due to the Ketcher race riot of 1923. A white woman was assaulted and murdered in the Ketcher community of Crawford County. Angry white mobs attempted lynching, and white people banded together to steal land and murder black people. In the late 1920s, there was a fire in one of the dormitories, so the boys were relocated to a farm where they worked and raised $10,000 worth of cotton. In December of 1930, an article in the Arkansas Gazette stated that farming was the most profitable and satisfactory method for handling the boys. The article also indicated that part of the land at the school would be planted with cotton and that the state board had acquired over 600 acres of land in Wrightsville. After the first fire, it became clear that the school was slowly being converted into a work farm, despite Tandy Washington Cogg's preference for education being a priority. In the 1930s, Tandy Washington hires Lester Gaines and his wife, Mary Gaines. Lester worked as a night supervisor and Mary as an assistant matron. Thus, the entire Coggs and Gaines family lived together and worked together at the NBIS until Governor Carl Bailey removed Tandy Washington from his role as superintendent in 1937. In 1936, the crop season was described as unusually productive, generating about 27,000. In the fiscal year that ended on June 30th, 1937, the state of Arkansas spent only $29,000 to operate the school. The boys were subjected to conditions akin to slavery, and Tandy Washington was powerless to intervene. This was largely because the superintendent did not control the funding, and the all-white Board of Education aimed to make the school as self-sufficient as possible. The Negro Boys Industrial School was relocated from Pine Bluff to Wrightsville in 1937 due to insufficient funds for a lease on 400 acres of land. The Henry Bros plantation owned 600 acres of land, which the board rented from him. A new agreement was established to put 300 of these acres into cultivation immediately. Within the following week, 25 boys were transferred to the Wrightsville location. Once the Negro Boys Industrial School was officially relocated, Tandy Washington Coggs was dismissed by Governor Carl Bailey. The youth dormitory was located in a rundown Works Progress Administration building that was constructed in 1936. At times, this facility housed as many as 100 children aged 13 to 17 in a dormitory where beds were positioned just a foot apart. Authorities placed black orphans, along with homeless children, on the work farm. As of March 1959, there were 69 boys between the ages of 13 and 17 enrolled at the Wrightsville School. According to Lester Gaines, the Negro superintendent of the reform school, most of the boys in the dormitory were there for minor offenses such as hubcap stealing or because their parents had separated and there was nowhere else for them to go. The institution became Exhibit A for the treatment that prevailed in Arkansas during segregation. Throughout the history of segregation, government employees, historians, and sociologists documented differences in the philosophy and physical structures of the white and black institutions in the state. For an example, the 1940 Benino Report to the governor notes the following vocational trades taught at the white boys' school, such as carpentry, cabinet work, glazing, painting, cement work, bricklaying, wood and metal operation, blacksmithing, welding, plastering, tailoring, and shoe mending. NBIS is mentioned only once as the recipient of 156 mattresses made by the White Boys Trade School. By the time of the fire, the differences had only become less. In 1956, sociologist Gordon Morgan, who will go on to become the first black professor at the University of Arkansas, wrote his master's degree thesis on the school, documenting the stunning level of squalor at the Wrightsville facility. He is quoted saying, "Many boys go for days with only rags for clothes. More than half of them wore neither socks nor underwear during the winter of 1955 and 1956. It is not uncommon to see youths going for weeks without bathing or changing clothes. At times, the number of boys at the school was over 100. There were no laundry equipment. A single 30-gallon hot water tank served the bathing needs of the entire population. The water was deemed undrinkable and was often reddish, with possible high levels of iron. Many employees brought their own drinking water to work. Governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, visited the school in January 1958, saying they need help. They are using some old wood stoves, which should be replaced, but Faubus had reduced the budget by $7,100. The Negro Boys Industrial School provided agriculture training to young black juvenile delinquents as its primary mission. The facility was a working cotton farm. The harsh, prison-like conditions were horrible. The existence of an institution of its kind is a reminder of the South's Jim Crow era of segregation. At one point during its existence, armed guards monitored the boys as they worked the cotton fields and were whipped with a leather strap for discipline. The deteriorating condition of the physical plant at Wrightsville may have been a significant cause of the 1959 fire. All buildings need extensive repairs, particularly the boys' living quarters, Morgan noted in 1956. As Wrightsville was supposed to be as self-sustaining in operation as possible, the emphasis was on farm yields. Maintenance was in short supply or non-existence. The conditions were so terrible that when the boys went to bed at night, they didn't have enough room to move around, especially if they had to go to the bathroom. They had to defecate in buckets. At 4 a.m. on a cold, wet morning, following earlier thunderstorms in the area, 16-year-old Arthur Ray Poole, one of the two sergeants, smelled smoke. According to Griff Stockley's book, the only source of warmth in the dormitory was a wood-burning stove made from an oil drum. Around 4 a.m., Arthur Ray Poole wakes up. There's no heat coming from the makeshift wood stove, but he could smell smoke. Arthur, who was in charge of the boys, calls out and asks if the wood heater has been lit, and one of the boys say no. Then Arthur rolls over and looks up at the ceiling and sees the fire coming across. Immediately, Arthur and the other sergeant, O.T. Charlie Meadows, began waking up the kids. According to survivors, it was complete hysteria because the fire had consumed a good portion of the dormitory within seconds. Arthur Ray Poole was one of the first to run over to a window, and he and O.T. Charlie, they both began working together to rip apart the heavy wire that was a part of the window so they could get out. There were about 16 windows in the dorm, but 2 windows could be ripped open through the wires because the fire was blocking the rest. Arthur Ray Poole saw that O.T. Charlie Meadows got one of the window coverings off as he climbed out the window, and he could see several kids fighting to get out. Arthur said in that quote, there was a lot of screaming and shouting. 4 or 5 boys would all try to get through the same window at once. They were all screaming at each other. At another window, 4 boys were hitting the window covering with a chair trying to get it off. A 15-year-old Robert Raymond was awakened by the smoke and the sounds of the boys screaming. Robert was interviewed by the press. He said, the only thing I could think of was how to get out of here. I ran towards the window screen nearest my bed and kicked out the screen and then left. The doors had been padlocked from the outside of the dormitory, and the windows were covered with heavy wire mesh. No adult supervisor was on duty, leaving the young boys trapped in their cramped sleeping quarters. Amidst the choking, blinding smoke and heat, 4 or 5 boys at a time tried to fight their way forward through the narrow openings as the fire began to devour them. O.T. Charlie Meadows, a 16-year-old night sergeant, helped break a window, allowing the boys to escape. A phone call was made to the Arkansas State Police, who then contacted the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department. The Sheriff's Department reached out to Little Rock Fire Department. However, Little Rock needed to get permission to send a fire truck since the fire was located outside the city limits. By the time the fire trucks finally arrived, it was too late. On that tragic March morning in 1959, 48 boys managed to escape from the dormitory fire, while 21 tragically lost their lives. When the smoke cleared, the boys who perished were found piled on top of one another in a corner of the building. According to Stockley, most of the boys that were killed had run back to a corner. Although there were a couple of doors, we know there was no one there to unlock them. The Arkansas Gazette provided a diagram of the destroyed dormitory, including measurements of the building and the locations of the bodies. The building was shaped like a U and measured 114 feet by 30 feet. It served various purposes, including functioning as a chapel or classroom. The two wings at each end of the building were not used as dormitory space. Instead, they served as a workshop and contained tools. Toward the front was a sewing room. I will upload the map on the They Forgot About Us Instagram page. One of the survivors, James Watson, thought that everyone had escaped until he heard the screams and shouting from inside the building. He and the other boys outside urged those still trapped to come to the windows, that they had already been kicked out, but they couldn't hear them over the chaos. They attempted to open the window where the group of the boys was trapped, but it wouldn't budge. Arthur Ray Poole recounted, "After we got outside, many of us started yelling to the others about the way out, but there was so much smoke and flames that I guess they didn't hear us. The boys who were caught in the fire became the pile of remains found after the flames were extinguished." O.T. Charlie Meadows was only 13 years old and could not push through the crowd of boys trying to escape. The first group of boys made it out and sprinted about 150 yards to wake up Lester Gaines. They brought him back with the keys, but there was too much fire to get to the doors. They were never unlocked. Instead of contacting the Little Rock Fire Department, Lester called the Arkansas State Police. The state police then contacted the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department, where a man named Sid Sebastian received the call, which was logged at 4:30 a.m. He called the Little Rock Fire Department. The final call was made by Dean Daly, the Little Rock city manager, who needed to get permission to send the fire truck to Wrightsville. Once the fire department arrived on the scene, it took additional time to set up because there were no fire hydrants nearby. They had to run 600 feet to a swimming pool for water. Furthermore, it had rained earlier that morning, making the massive field between the pool and the school muddy. To position the truck for pumping water from the pool, firefighters with assistance from school employees laid down lumber to prevent the truck from getting stuck in the mud. State Fire Captain W.A. Seaton stated that it was already too late by that time, as the building was nearly destroyed when they arrived. Arkansas Governor Orville Fabus arrived on the scene at about 6 a.m. that morning. The press described him as angry and visibly shaken by what happened. It was a scene from the underworld. No human being should have viewed the charred remains of children. Orville Fabus and Lester Gaines had some words to each other on the scene, but it was not recorded. A photographer captured the two men standing side by side. Superintendent Gaines told the press that morning that most of the boys in the dormitory were in for minor offenses such as hubcap stealing or because their parents split up and there was no place for them to go. Gaines told UPI reporter Bernie Brown that one of the boys we lost was sent here because he was soaping windows on Halloween. Gaines also told a reporter that the threat of such a tragedy was inherited in the school's budget of $32,000 for salaries. They ranged from $3,780 for him down to $1,080 a year. He said he had 5 teachers on the staff. Lester Gaines was in shock. He appeared red-eyed and nearly exhausted. He did speak to a younger boy whose statements contradicted those of the other boys in the room regarding what had happened. The official responsible for the investigation of the fire was State Fire Marshal W.C. Strombean. Strombean's position was that of an employee of the Arkansas State Police, an organization tightly under the control of the governor. Lieutenant Strombean's job was complicated by the intense heat. He told the press the next day that the ruins were too hot yesterday to investigate thoroughly, but we have a crew conducting a more complete investigation today. It looks like an electrical fire. 48 boys who managed to escape through the windows were swarmed by the press. They were described as standing around barefoot and crying as they watched firefighters carry out bodies. 14-year-old George Gray was in shock. He could only stutter his name and hometown and had sustained a cut from a piece of glass. Most families learned about the fire through the radio. Lavina, who is Lindsay's mother, was listening to gospel music when there was an interruption for a news bulletin. After they spoke about the fire, Lavina immediately runs to her neighbor's house for help. Her neighbor's name is Buster Sullivan, and he agreed to drive Lavina to Wrightsville to see if Lindsay was among those who had died. She said, "What they showed me was burnt up bodies, all piled together, a small pile of red flesh. There was no way I could identify my boy. No one said anything." William Lloyd Pegg's sister, Dr. Edna Green, said, "Up until this day, we don't know whether that was my brother or not. My parents just selected a body, but we couldn't recognize him." Lester Gaines left the scene stating, "I finally walked away because I couldn't stand the odor of the bodies being burned." Family member Frank Lawrence expressed frustration, saying the crime scene was destroyed. He pointed out that the science of preserving a crime scene already existed in 1959. They were dismantling the whole scene with hoses, brakes, and shovels. It felt like they were trying to cover something up, he mentioned. The investigation into the fire did not commence on the same morning it occurred. According to State Fire Marshal W.C. Strombean, they attempted to determine the cause of the fire on that day, but the intense heat made it impossible. Consequently, the investigation did not officially start until March 6, 1959. Meanwhile, for the boys who survived, officials converted one of the classrooms into a temporary dormitory. Other institutions donated blankets and beds while the injured were taken to the infirmary for treatment. Within hours of the fire, what remained of the boys was taken to 2 local funeral homes where the body parts were wrapped in newspaper. Lubin Yalong and Frank Lawrence reported that Lindsay Cross was taken to Hubble Funeral Home along with other remains. Stephanie Webb, the owner of Haven Forest Cemetery, provided information about cemetery records to ABC7 in 2017. She stated that most of the bodies were sent to Dubuisson Funeral Home, which is no longer operating. However, according to Stephanie Webb, there are questions regarding how Dubuisson Funeral Home received the bodies, among other issues. Frank Lawrence mentioned that families could simply walk in and select the remains. Governor Orville Faubus launched a scathing attack during his press conference on the morning following the fire. He suggested that the responsibility for the boys' deaths rested entirely with Lester Gaines, implying that Gaines had failed to ensure their safety by not having an employee present in the building at the night to respond to emergencies. On March 7th and March 9th of 1959, a school board hearing took place. The chairman of the board was Alfred Smith, and it consisted of only 3 members because Governor Orville Faubus had not appointed additional members. Present at the hearing were Chairman Alfred Smith and board members J.C. Hawkins and A.E. Woods. Mrs. E. Guyven was the first person interviewed. She worked as a receptionist, secretary, and bookkeeper, and it was her responsibility to create the schedules. When asked who was supposed to be in charge of the boys that night, she stated that it was Mr. Austin and Mr. Hall, as both held keys to the dormitory. When the fire broke out, the school nurse, Mabel Fleming, called Mrs. Guyven, who then sent her husband to assist. Alfred Smith asked whether she knew if Mr. Austin and Mr. Hall were in the building at the time of the fire. She replied that she didn't know, but according to their work chart, they were supposed to be there. The house director, Althena Wood Martin, worked with Lee Austin and Wilson Hall during the day and was certain they were assigned to the building on the night of March 4th. Althena Wood Martin defended Lester Gaines and told the board that she knew he had someone fill in for Mr. Banks' place. Also told the board she has been an employee at the MBIS for 4 years. She said, "I just know he had someone fill in for Mr. Banks' place. Mr. Gaines is one of the finest men I have ever known, and he certainly has these boys' interests at heart." Mabel Fleming was a school nurse. Industrial teacher Bernard Hallam Childress informed the board that they heard Lester Gaines had assigned Wilson Hall and Lee Austin to work the night shift in place of Mr. Banks, who had been unable to work since February due to illness. Winton Madison, who worked in the school shop, stated that he was aware of the scheduling and confirmed that Lee Austin and Wilson Hall were set to take over Mr. Banks' duties. He also mentioned that when he arrived at the scene of the fire, Mr. Gaines, Mr. Hall, Mr. Austin, Miss Fleming, and Mr. Childress were all present. By that time, the flames had already surrounded the building. It is important to note that Lester Gaines fulfilled his responsibility to ensure that Mr. Banks was replaced due to illness. Wilson Hall and Lee Austin were supposed to be monitoring the boys on the morning of the fire. Wilson Hall had been a farm manager for about a year. He informed the board that he woke up every morning around 3 a.m. Lester Gaines had instructed him to inspect the buildings and check on the boys, as well as on Lee Austin. He also mentioned that he was supposed to conduct these checks every night until Mr. Banks returned. Wilson Hall stated that Austin was always on duty during his checks. When the fire broke out, Wilson Hall claimed he was the first person to arrive at the dorm. However, he was unable to enter, so he ran around to the back and began removing screens. Lillian Hall, Wilson's wife, informed the board that he left their house between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. Mrs. Hall confirmed that before 3 a.m., her husband had been at home until it was time for him to conduct his checks. Lee Austin worked as a livestock supervisor and had been employed at the MBIS for about 2 years before the fire. He informed the board that he was in the building until around 3 a.m. when the lights went out. Lee lived on campus with his wife, who was the cook. He mentioned that he quickly ran to his house to grab a flashlight. While searching for the flashlight, he noticed a bright light and heard yelling. The board questioned him about being absent for more than 30 minutes. He explained that the weather was very bad, making it difficult for him to find the flashlight. However, when the board asked his wife if he had come home, she stated that he had not come home. The next person interviewed was Lester Gaines. He informed the board that Lee Austin and Wilson Hall would remain in the building until the boys were checked on in the morning. Additionally, he stated that Wilson Hall was responsible for ensuring that Lee Austin stayed awake and didn't fall asleep. Lester Gaines mentioned that for the past 6 months, there had been issues with bad wiring in the caretaker's room, and the floors were also in poor condition. He explained that he did not have sufficient funds to rewire the entire building and that the necessary funds needed to be appropriated by the Legislative Council. He stated there was no way to have prevented the fire, but he would have taken steps to discipline or terminate them had he known they were not doing their job. On Monday, March 9th, the day before the mass funeral at Haven for Rest Cemetery, Alfred Smith, the chairman of the board of directors, informed the press that the board had completed its investigation and that the report would be released around 5:30 p.m. However, Smith later decided to postpone the release to March 10th because the governor needed to view the report first. On March 10, 1959, was the day of the mass funeral and burial of the 14 unidentified boys. The Arkansas Gazette reviewed the arrangements for the 14 boys who will be buried in individual caskets but in a mass grave. As for the other 7 victims, Pulaski County Coroner Dr. Howard Dishall reported that he had identified one of the other boys and that the relatives had identified the other 6. Reverend Charles Walker read scriptures while standing beside 14 different coffins. The families in attendance were in deep pain, with tears streaming down their faces as they tried their best to remain composed. Opening the caskets was not permitted. Lester Gaines was present and was described as sitting motionless, staring at the coffins. Occasionally, he would break into sobs. He said, "I wish it could have been me. Those boys only wanted someone to love them, and God, I love them all. I love them so much." After Reverend Charles Walker finished his prayer, the families were escorted away from the gravesite and were not permitted to watch as the coffins were lowered into the ground. Some people are speculating that this was a cover-up. There are doubts about whether their bodies are actually in the coffins. It was held at the Haven for Rest Cemetery. The 14 boys buried at Haven for Rest were Lindsey Cross, age 14, Charles L. Thomas, age 15, Frank Barnes, age 15, R.D. Brown, age 16, Jesse Carpenter Jr., age 16, Joe Crittenden, age 16, John Daniel, age 16, Willie G. Horner, age 16, Roy Chester Powell, age 16, Cecil Preston, age 17, Carl E. Thornton, age 15, Johnny Tillison, age 16, Edward Tolson Jr., age 15, and Charles White, age 15. 7 of the 21 boys were buried privately by their families. The boys were Henry Daniels, age 15, John Alfred George, age 15, Amos Geis, age 16, Roy Hedgewood, age 15, O.T. Meadows, age 13, Willie Pegg, and Willie Lee Williams. A few days passed without the Board of Education releasing their report to the press. The delay was due to Orville Fabus being unhappy with their conclusion. The Board of Education stated that based on the facts revealed during this investigation, they agree that this tragedy could not have been prevented. They believe that everyone involved made an effort to fulfill their responsibilities. However, they recommended that those directly responsible for supervising the building in question be severely reprimanded. A thorough examination of Gaines' public omissions and contradictory statements made to the press and during the hearing in the days following the fire indicates at least some negligence and wrongdoing on the part of the superintendent. It's also important to note that the Wrightsville institution, through no fault of the superintendent, was critically short-staffed compared to Pine Bluff. Governor Orville Fabus is upset and has announced that he will conduct his investigation to get to the bottom of the issue. 2 weeks later, on March 25, 1959, Fabus held another press conference where he recommended the termination of Lester Gaines, his wife, and several other employees. He tells reporters that he has evidence suggesting that Lester Gaines gathered certain employees and pressured them before the board hearing. When the employees were questioned about whether Lester Gaines had spoken to them, they all denied it. Allegedly, 2 employees went to the governor's mansion and spoke to him privately. On March 25, 1959, 11 employees released statements against Governor Fabus. Lester Gaines had the support of the Arkansas State Press, which was the largest statewide African-American newspaper at the time. Now, at the next board meeting, Alfred Smith announced the termination of the employees recommended by the governor, including Lester Gaines. 9 other employees quit in protest. Orville Fabus requested that Frank Holt, the prosecuting attorney for Pulaski County, investigate the fire and consider pressing criminal charges. Holt began his investigation during the winter of 1960. Rather than making a decision himself about whether to file charges, he referred the case to the Pulaski County Grand Jury, which launched its investigation. Witnesses were questioned, and the grand jury's final report indicated that the responsibility for the tragedy rested on many individuals. The board of directors outlined the significant hazards and challenges faced by the school. Orville Fabus was frustrated that he couldn't place the blame on Lester Gaines. After 2 years of testimony and investigation, each family member received between $1,000 and $2,000 for the loss of their children. However, no one ever faced criminal charges. The prevailing theory regarding the fire was that it resulted from faulty wiring. Reports indicated that the damaged wires were found in the caretaker's office, but those reports were never made public. Most of the information related to the incident was either destroyed or is missing. All of this documentation would have highlighted the negligence of Governor Orville Fabus during his time in office. Following Lindsey Cross' death, his family was awarded a total of $3,400 for his estate. Lindsey's mother, Luvina, received $600 for mental anguish, while his father, Charlie Cross, was awarded $300. Luvina mentioned that she had only received a $1,000 check from a white man who came to her home. When she attempted to cash the check at a Square Deal pawn shop, the store owner asked her, "Is this all Fabus gave you for killing your son?" Stephanie Webb stated that the cemetery records showed a bronze grave marker was purchased for the boys a few months after their death, and that the purchase was made by the state. However, she has never seen the marker and does not know its current location. As a result, the young boys are buried without a tombstone. On March 4, 2011, the state of Arkansas proclamation was signed declaring Arkansas Negro Boys Industrial School Fire Remembrance Day. On April 21, 2018, a monument was placed on their graves by the Friends of Haven for Rest. This monument was partially funded by a grant from the Black History Commission of Arkansas and presented by the Friends of Haven for Rest 59 years after the burial. On March 13, 2019, the Arkansas State House of Representatives passed H.R. 1049. On March 19, 2019, resolution is read on the House floor. On April 25, 2019, a monument was unveiled for the boys at the Wrightsville unit of the Arkansas Department of Correction, which was the former home of the Negro Boys Industrial School. Griffin Stockley's book, Black Boys Burning, explores the history of the school, the events leading up to the fire, and the aftermath. I recommend everyone to read it. May the young boys, Lindsey Cross, Charles L. Thomas, Frank Barnes, R.D. Brown, Jesse Carpenter Jr., Joe Crittenden, John Daniel, Willie G. Horner, Roy Chester Powell, Cecil Preston, Carl E. Thornton, Johnny Tilson, Edward Tolston Jr., Charles White, Henry Daniels, John Alfred George, Amos Geis, Roy Hedgewood, O.T. Meadows, Willie Pagey, and Willie Lee Williams, also known as the Wrightsville 21. May you rest in peace. Thank you for listening. Follow us on Instagram at They Forgot About Us Podcast. Please email us at theyforgotaboutus@gmail.com. Leave us a comment and give us a rating.